The next few weeks are going to be really full of art, and I would encourage you to get here at 10:15, if not slightly before, because we have just wonderful, wonderful things to cover, lots of it. We'll be meeting consecutively the next 3 weeks, and the last one will not be in here because the Easter egg hunt has something to do with this room as well. And I'm hoping we can be in the Pittenger Center, but I'll let you know. In any case, we're going to be meeting for the next 2 weeks, and then I'll let you know what's happening on the 3rd. We are covering in the reading material 2 miracles, the healing of the demoniac in Mark 5 and the raising of Lazarus in John 11, but I'm really going to focus on the second, on Lazarus's resurrection, because that is the one that really, as Whitney Cunningham, our writer, talks about, broke the camel's back. It really brought the house down on Jesus. And it does seem kind of perverse that his healing people and comforting them and bringing them back to life should arouse such ire and actually lead to his arrest and crucifixion. But I guess it's often the case that the good news is always bad news for someone. And the religious leaders of that day certainly felt that their hold on the people was threatened by Jesus' personal power and authority. And they thought that their legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman overlords would be undermined if Jesus' popularity continued to grow. So the raising of Lazarus really puts him in the crosshairs of both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, 2 groups that normally were completely at odds with each other, but who were brought together in order to unite against Jesus and find a way that they could put him to death. The resurrection of Lazarus is part of a whole suite of incidents in the Gospel of John, and to understand it properly, we really need to see it in context. You remember that the chapter divisions that we have in the Bible were arbitrarily added later. It read as a scroll, so you can read chapters 9 through 11 as a continuity, and that's what I would encourage you to do. So we begin with the healing of the man born blind. And you'll remember the story. The disciples see this man born blind, and they ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, neither one sinned. This happens so that the glory of God can be revealed. He then makes a paste of mud and saliva, and he applies it to the man's eyes. He instructs him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, which he does, and he receives his sight. Jesus then melts away into the crowds. The man has never seen Jesus. He's only heard him. And the man, we'll just arbitrarily call him Joe. Joe becomes an object of curiosity and suspicion, especially to the Pharisees, who interrogate him. Who is this man who healed you on the Sabbath of all times? And Joe says, well, it was a man called Jesus. And he explains about the mud and going to wash in the pool of Siloam, and that then he could see. And then they ask him, well, where is this Jesus? And he says, I don't know. A little later, they repeat these questions, and they push him, and they demand to know, well, what do you think of this man, Jesus? And he said, well, he's a prophet. So he's making kind of progress in his understanding of Jesus. Then they interview his parents, and they can't get satisfaction from them, so they bring Joe back and ask him. They say, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. And Joe is exasperated, and he just says, look, all I know is that I was blind, and now I see. The man cannot be a sinner, because a sinner cannot do such works as this. Who ever heard of a sinner healing a man born blind? He must be from God. Well, this completely infuriates the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they expel him and his parents from the synagogue, the temple. They basically excommunicate them. Jesus hears about this. He seeks out the man who up until now, remember, has never seen him. And he asks him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man must have perked up his ears at a voice that sounds strangely familiar. And he says, "Who is he that I might believe in him?" And Jesus replies, "You have now seen him." It is, in fact, the person who is speaking to you. And that's when the penny drops. And he realizes that this is the voice of the man who heals him. And he falls down and worships Jesus. It's one of those wonderful recognition scenes. He recognizes his voice. And that leads to this wonderfully dramatic moment. Now follows a beautiful transition into Jesus' teaching on the Good Shepherd, who's willing to lay down his life for the sheep. The sheep know his voice, and he calls them by name and leads them out. The sheep follow him because they know his voice. And the shepherd has come, Jesus says, to lead them into a life that's abundant. Now, the teaching about the Good Shepherd, who calls his sheep by name as they listen for his voice, just as the blind man did, then segues into the segment about Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, all close friends of Jesus. Word comes to Jesus that Lazarus is very sick, unto death. But he doesn't go right then to his friends. In fact, he waits 2 days until Lazarus is, in fact, dead. When he finally arrives, Lazarus has been dead 4 days, and both Martha and Mary kind of reproach him, and they say, "You know, if you had come earlier, our brother would not have died." But then Martha takes a great leap of faith. When Jesus declares to her that he himself is the resurrection and the life, she believes. She says, "I know that you are the Christ, the Son of God." And it's through that kind of childlike trust and faith that Jesus works this amazing miracle. He asks to be brought to the tomb. He asks that the stone be removed. And Martha hesitates. She says there's going to be a stench. But Jesus proceeds to call out to his friend by name, "Lazarus, come forth." And from beyond the grave, Lazarus hears his name being called, and he comes forth recognizing the voice of his dear friend and his Lord. He comes from the darkness that's even darker than blindness, the darkness of death, back to life. So the stories of the blind man, the Good Shepherd, and the raising of Lazarus all work together to create a process, if you will, of recognition. They show what it is to hear the voice of Christ and be healed, be brought back to life. So today we're going to be looking at a number of scenes that depict this from the very beginning, because it was such a critical episode in the life of Jesus, right up to almost modern day. So if you will dim the lights, please. Starting very early, an ivory plaque from Venice from the 9th or the 10th century. This is right before Lazarus actually comes to life. The stone has been removed. Jesus is making his command, and everybody's kind of waiting. But here, Lazarus is coming to life, because you see the gesture of surprise that Peter is making. You see the worshipful attitude here, and Jesus making this gesture. So we've gone from death to life. Palermo from the 1200s, a mosaic. It's called the Anastasis, the Resurrection of Lazarus. And the first indication of the stench. And you're going to see this in any number of pictures. They like to show that, in fact, there was an odor, or they were worried about it. And you see the gestures of surprise, and Lazarus is coming forth from the tomb alive. You see the two sisters bending down at Christ's feet. We've been at the Scrovegni Chapel, the Arena Chapel, a number of times because that's where actually the Renaissance begins, with Giotto. And it stalls as the plague breaks out in Florence and sweeps through Italy. So after Giotto's life, art kind of goes into a period of hibernation, and then the Renaissance really starts. But it all begins here, and we're looking at this particular panel in this beautiful chapel, which I hope you'll all see one day. It's Giotto's first version of the Resurrection of Lazarus. And once again, you can see that people are worried about the smell. They're gestures of surprise, but we're really not certain at what stage Lazarus is. The stone has certainly been removed, but if we zoom in, he still looks pretty dead. They're beginning to unwrap him, so I assume he is coming to life, but it's really kind of a terrifying picture. The man on the left is showing his surprise, so there must be some sign that Lazarus is returning, but it's unusual, and we're going to see how Giotto changes it subsequently in Assisi, which was painted a few years later. This is the panel that we're going to be looking at, and we'll look at it up close. You see that Lazarus here looks much more lifelike. He's gained color. The stone has been taken away. Jesus is gesturing, and here we see in Latin the words, "Lazarus, come forth." Peter gesticulating his surprise, the grave cloths being taken away, masks covering the face. And we'll move in to see the beautiful color of Jesus' face and the figure on the left with the wonderful molding of the face, what the French call the carnation, the color of the skin, that rose kind of hue, which is not that easy to achieve in fresco and to mold the body that way. So we're making enormous progress here. This you remember from last time. It's Raphael's very famous scene of the Transfiguration with the demoniac down below, whom the disciples could not heal. And I promised you that we would talk a little later about the rivalry that was being set up between the artist Raphael and Michelangelo. Michelangelo at this time was a well-established figure both in Florence and in Rome. He had finished his monumental statue of David. He had done the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was just coming into his glory. And we'll see the kind of honor that Raphael does to the great master in his most famous work, The School of Athens, with the philosophers Plato and Aristotle here. And down here, front and center, is the figure of Michelangelo in the guise of Heraclitus, the early pre-Socratic philosopher. So he features him front and center because he did owe a great deal to what Michelangelo had developed in terms of style and musculature, the kind of turning wonderful bodies that Raphael depicts here. The rivalry was set up by this man, Giulio de Medici. At this time, he's a cardinal. He's cardinal over a number of areas, but particularly Narbonne in France. And he has ordered two pictures. We'll give you a close-up of him. Two pictures to be done for the cathedral in Narbonne. One by Raphael, a Transfiguration, which you have seen. The other a raising of Lazarus that he has petitioned Michelangelo to do. And Michelangelo was a protégé of the Medici family. He virtually grew up in the Medici household. So Giulio might have expected that he would accede to his wishes, but Michelangelo would have none of it. He'd done enough painting for the time being. He perceived of himself as a sculptor. He didn't want to do this piece, but he said, what I will do is ask my favorite protégé to do the work, and I will do the major designs for him. So Giulio accepts that. Giulio, by the way, when he becomes Clement VII, is a problematic character, to say the least. He was the person in charge when Rome was sacked in 1527 and was never the same. He was largely responsible for that. He also was the Pope in charge when Henry VIII petitioned for divorce from Catherine of Aragon to Anne Boleyn. He refused, and consequently the Church of England hived off from the Church of Rome. So he presided over some pretty tempestuous times, and he himself seemed to like to create a bit of trouble, as he did between these two men. So this is the picture that is the end result of the petition to Michelangelo. It's really a marvelous, marvelous work of art in its own right. If you see it in its own glory, the colors are absolutely vivid. You can see it even better online than you can here. The brilliant greens contrasting with the complementary reds, the blues and the pinks, it all just pops out of this picture, and your eye is guided through by the colors and by the white that weaves through it as you get down to the wonderful figure of Lazarus. And we'll take a look at this figure of Lazarus because he is of critical importance. It was his body that was principally designed by Michelangelo. We know this because we have the design, which is wonderful in and of itself. This is the Lazarus figure, and these are the men who are helping him to get out of the tomb and out of his grave cloths. What you have to do is compare it to the figure of Adam. And all you have to do is flip the image of Lazarus over, and he assumes the same posture as Adam. This is a very telling quotation is the proper art history term. It's a quotation. Michelangelo is quoting himself. And we'll see how this spells out more meaning in the picture as you take a look at the gesture of Christ toward Lazarus. Where have we seen that before? Indeed, if you take the figure of God pointing and compare it to Jesus' arm, they're the very same. And Michelangelo has set his protégé, Del Piombo, up to recall the Sistine Chapel ceiling and his own glorious work. What he is saying in this picture, and it has such a powerful theological message, is that Jesus' power to give life to Lazarus is the very same power that God the Father had transmitted to Adam to give his life. And he does this in a very subtle way, but that was unmistakable to anybody in Rome at that time, because the Sistine Chapel ceiling was the talk of the town and had been for some years now, so everybody would recognize what Piombo has done. Raphael recognized it, and this picture was finished some time before Raphael finished his. Raphael got a chance to see it and immediately began changing his own picture to be much more colorful, much more muscular, and I'll let you take your pick. The more I thought about the one on the right, the more I was moved by it. Nobody that I know of has kind of looked into the theological meaning of, actually what Michelangelo and Del Piombo are saying is that Jesus is God, has the same power to give life. They point out the similarity of gestures, comparing it to the creation in the Sistine Chapel, but nobody seems to pick up the importance of the picture. So I signal that out to you and let you compare, decide which one you prefer. A lot of people prefer the Transfiguration. I'm kind of hovering. This is not nearly as exciting a work. The colors aren't as vivid. It's much more mannerist in tone and in its presentation. You see, once again, the people holding their noses. But it is as derivative, in a sense, as the pictures we've just seen. It's borrowing, but not with the same intelligence. As Picasso, I think it was, once said, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." Well, he borrowed, and I'll show you how he borrowed. You take a look at that back up there, and where have we seen that before? Right here in the Sistine Chapel with the Libyan Sibyl. You just turn them around and face each other, and it's the very same thing. But it doesn't mean that much. Therefore, it's just a borrowing. It's not freighted with meaning. The same thing is true of this lovely young lady down in the bottom, one of the sisters, either Mary or Martha. And where have we seen her before? In the Transfiguration itself. If you just turn her around and then compare her, it's the very same woman. But he's borrowed these things to no real effect. Michelangelo's borrowing and allusion to himself through his protégé really is freighted with meaning and significance, but this isn't. It's just a kind of a throwaway copycat. But it's good to see those things. It's good to see Salviati compared to people who are greater. The wonderful Caravaggio at his chiaroscuro best. This is one of his last paintings. He's nearing his death, which takes place in 1610. He's in Sicily at this time. He's able to rest there for a while. He's been on the lam. He's hoping to get a pardon from Rome so he can return there because he's been under a charge of murder. He's in endless scrapes throughout his life. So he's waiting for this pardon to come from Cardinal Borghese, and it's thought that it actually did come, but he died at sea before, he got sick and died, before he actually received it. But during this period of quiet in Sicily, he executed some wonderful works, and this is one of them. It's in very bad shape. It needs to be restored in a big way, but we can learn a lot about this wonderful kind of frieze-like scene if we look at some of its antecedents. Wonderful stretched out body there. The gesture that Christ is making is the very same one that is apparent here in his call of Matthew. This is Jesus pointing, and you can see Matthew here saying, "Who, me?" That's the call of Matthew, very famous. And at this point, Caravaggio does not have access to his usual models and so forth, and so he's quoting himself, if you will, borrowing from what he's done before and from the drawings of others which he has access to, as you'll see in a moment. So there's the gesture, and there are the two together. So if you just flip Jesus around from the earlier picture, it's the very same one. It's just in reverse. It's a mirror image of it. If you look at the body itself here, it is borrowed from this engraving of a Giulio Romano fresco in Mantua. I'll show you the fresco. And this is Menelaus, the great Greek warrior, saving the body now, who is the body of Patroclus, who has died in battle, taking the place of Achilles. He's saving him, and Caravaggio has seen not necessarily the fresco, but he's seen the engraving, and therefore creates a body in the very same posture with a Menelaus figure holding the body of Lazarus in a very similar position. And this is a quotation. People were familiar with this wonderful fresco of Giulio Romano's in Mantua, and so he's knowledgeably doing this. It's a classical allusion. It takes people back to a Greek world, but it is a quotation nonetheless. Totally different vibe, totally different kind of aesthetic with the Northern School. This is one of the first painters from Holland, not from Belgium, but from the Dutch Netherlands, to use oil paints. He's a contemporary of Van Eyck's, and you can see the highly detailed work that all of the Northern School is capable of. You can just examine this with a microscope and still see details. It's very unusual because we aren't accustomed to seeing people buried inside in this way, but that is the way it was done in the northern countries, such as the Netherlands, where it's very damp and burying people in the soil was problematic. So they were buried inside, and therefore Lazarus is coming out of the pavement, so to speak, with his sisters here on the left. Wonderful brocades and exotic costumes. The Pharisees commenting, wondering what's going on, demanding an explanation, onlookers back here. And the wonderful porphyry columns and marble columns. This is Gürtgen, who was the student of Uvater, the one we just saw. A kind of amusing image in some ways, highly detailed, very beautiful, but peculiar too. We'll take a look a little more closely at this group. You see one of the sisters, Martha or Mary. You see the donor's wife over here. And what do we have here but a little doll-like daughter? This is to indicate the unimportance, the relative unimportance, first of all, of the donor's wife, who is smaller, and then of the daughter, who is smaller still. We look over on the left side. The donor is down at the bottom, slightly larger than his wife. He's positioned next to Lazarus. You see the little dog, who actually is more important in some ways than the daughter. It's almost as big. And if you zoom in on the daughter, she really is like a tiny little mannequin. Wonderful, wonderful landscape at the top, which you expect from the northern painters, with that beautiful aerial perspective that takes you from the vivid colors in the foreground back through paler and paler colors to take your eye out into the distance. If we look at it more closely, we see the wonderful pale blues as it recedes, and you see the figures of the two sisters with Jesus and the disciples. This is the earlier scene when they have come to him and said, "We wish you had come earlier," and so forth. So that's the scene that precedes the one that takes the foreground. So an unusual but very beautifully painted work. This, if you can stay after, I have a short film explaining some of the history and significance of this altarpiece by Michael Pacher. He's done the whole thing. It's carved and painted. It's not too far from Vienna, and we'll look a little more closely at the inside of the altarpiece as it opens out. He's carved all of this deep recede. It's in linden wood, carved and then colored, painted. Absolutely magnificent work. And when the altarpiece is closed, you have these scenes from the life of Jesus. On the inside, you have more scenes from the life of Mary. But we're looking at this particular one. You can see the emphasis he has put on perspective, because in 3 of these pictures, he's gone to great lengths to use tiles and the vaulted roofs to take your eye back. And this means that he has been in touch with the Italian school, learned perspective even before Dürer, who comes later, had any idea of it. So he's really a forerunner in his field. That scene of the resurrection seen close up, and once again, it's an inside interior with Lazarus in this very unusual position. We're seeing him from the back, and that is almost never done. Seeing him arise and seeing, let our eye be taken out right through the archway with the vaulted ceiling taking us back. And we still have people holding their noses. This is Juan de Flandre, and we've seen some of his work before in the tiny little predel scenes that went into a great big altarpiece that have all been scattered and separated over the entire face of the earth. But this is a separate, larger painting that he did of the resurrection of Lazarus. And once again, you see the highly detailed work. You can see the brocade on her dress as clearly as you can see the windows and the highly wrought plant life. It's just beautifully executed. I love the brocades, the shimmer of the cloth. It's a wonderful, small work of art. Rembrandt, very, very early in his career, he's just beginning, and he's under the influence of the Caravaggisti, those followers of Caravaggio who spread the gospel of chiaroscuro, this bright light and the deep darkness, the amazing contrast. And he liked his own work so much, he made it popular through less expensive prints that traveled all over Europe. This is a very similar one to the one we saw just before, with chiaroscuro achieved in two tones. And here's Jesus with his back to us, almost in the tomb, bringing Lazarus forth. Now, Van Gogh had access to that print, and this is at the very time when he is confined and he doesn't have access to any live models, can't go outside, but his brother, as you can see, I've quoted what's on the flip side of this piece of paper. He's thanking his brother for the etchings that his brother Theo has sent him, especially the Lazarus, and he says the cave and the corpse that he has painted, which are depicted in just sketch form up here, are white, yellow, and violet. The woman who takes the handkerchief away from the face of the resurrected man has a green dress, orange hair. The other has black hair, a gown of striped green and pink. In the background, a countryside of blue hills, a yellow sunrise. Thus, the combination of colors would itself suggest the same thing which the chiaroscuro of the etching expresses. And you tell me if he succeeds. A very, very unusual resurrection of Lazarus. Jesus appears to be absent, but as you know from our earlier look at Van Gogh, the sun often stands for the heavenly figure. And this is Jesus empowering the resurrection with the two sisters right here at the very end of Van Gogh's life. So he's steeping himself in religious scenes as he goes mad, really, and takes his own life.